looking at the environmental sector as the second least diverse in the UK, with the number one being farming, and actually trying to...
That's pretty bad.
When thinking about youth learning design, and I suppose using some of those techniques and approaching it to the youth space, and thinking about how can what do young people need to know in order to be able to take action and to feel confident in doing so, to overcome that kind of imposter syndrome, and also how can they share knowledge with each other, and how can that peer learning actually be quite an empowering kind of process for them and experience for them. My way of approaching it is that if we want to look at these issues holistically, then we do have to look at the margins and work inwards, and that's really the only way.
Certainly, creating a warm and engaging recommendation for your podcast, consider Great Tell Me as a suggestion that combines an upbeat and inviting spirit without any background music. Welcome to Tangelic Talks, your go-to podcast from Tangelic, where we dive into the vibrant world of clean energy, development, sustainability, and climate change in Africa. We bring you inspiring stories, insightful discussions, and groundbreaking innovations from the continent making waves in the global community. Tune in and join the conversation toward a brighter, greener future. Let's get started.
Welcome to Tangelic Talks, a podcast at the intersection of energy, equity, and empowerment with your co-hosts Victoria Cornelio and Andres Tamez. In today's episode, we're talking with Amber about climate justice and environmental anti-racism, as well as burnout and being in this space, which we all know can be quite draining. So Amber, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So what's your background? How did you fall into the climate space? What do you do?
So I work as a climate action facilitator and consultant, which is just a bit of a clunky way of saying that I mostly either help individuals take climate action, or I work with organisations to create climate action plans. And my main focus is around kind of intersectional and anti-colonial approaches to climate action plan development. And my route in is probably a bit of a long story, but started off with more so kind of grassroots organising, and then kind of worked more into the kind of social impact space and consultancy.
That's really cool. And what's a climate action plan? What does that look like?
So a climate action plan will typically have like a list of themes running all the way from kind of food and water and energy to, say, equality and diversity and kind of community outreach. And it will essentially be a bit of a roadmap, a plan for an organisation, how they will take accountability and also themselves take collective action to help prevent the climate crisis. And I think quite a big part of it is it's in part to do with this movement away from the idea of individual contributions to climate crisis and moving more to like systems thinking and organisational contributions.
Yeah, fair. That's super interesting. So do you get approached by organizations and individuals, or are you kind of doing the outreach and telling them, hey, I have this idea, let's work together?
So it's a mixture of both. So sometimes organizations might get in touch, and sometimes it's through a program. So for example, I used to work with schools to help them develop climate action plans. And that was in response to the DFE's kind of sustainability strategy. Mm-hmm. And they would sign on to a program and we would work with them to help them create like youth-led climate action plans.
Right. That's super cool.
Yeah. You mentioned that you started like with a grassroots approach, right? And what sort of, I just want to know, just so we start from the bottom, what do you do as at the bottom level, right, to organize for just sustainability and the climate? Like what are the starting projects that you worked on?
Starting projects. So I think one of the first organisations that I really started working with, and this was on a voluntary grassroots basis, was Global Justice Now. And a lot of that work looked like, I suppose it's the first kind of network building. There isn't an organisational platform to jump off. So a lot of it was around bringing people together, leading and designing kind of educational workshops around what does this even mean, global justice? What do we mean by that? And how does climate fit into this? How does trade justice fit into this? So I think a lot of it is around network building and bringing people together, communities together. And as at least in my experience, it starts to trail up to more kind of organizational climate work, then it's more like partnerships. We look at partnerships more than community, community from the ground up, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's quite cool. And I mean, you've been in this space for a while now, but what first inspired you to step into sort of climate justice work? Because a lot of times we're getting a lot better at it, but a lot of times it's seen as separate things, like the climate crisis is its own thing and justice is its own thing. So how did you kind of find yourself in the middle? What inspired that?
So, this will actually take me back to global justice now. So I actually didn't start kind of climate activism or climate action work until I moved to Bristol.
Right.
And for those who don't know of Bristol, Bristol is quite an environmentally conscious city. It's also quite a diverse city. And it's one with quite an interesting context around activism and around how cultures express through art and music, and a lot of activism and music scenes have born out of Bristol. So it's a place where a lot is happening when it comes to climate action. And I started working with some of these grassroots organizations, and then it was when I stumbled across Global Justice Now that I had this sense of it's clicked. I understand what I was missing before. Because for me, I realized why I wasn't feeling fully connected to the environmental movement was actually because that justice element hadn't been brought in, and that intersectionality element hadn't been brought in by other groups I was working with. So it was when I started working with them that's when I started going down that path.
And I mean, it's a hard one because we always have this issue, especially in activism, where it's like we don't want to focus on too many topics at once, right? We want a unifying message and we want it to resonate, but also a lot of these topics do intersect. So have you found the balance of how do we bring all the aspects we want to talk about in here without losing the focus?
Could you say a little bit more in terms of what you mean around losing the focus?
Well, so for example, if you go to a protest about oil spillage, it might, for some people, it might come across a bit random to then be talking about intersectionality and how oil spills affect women more than men because of X, Y, and Z. You know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of issues that are, if we are talking in a holistic sense, affect everyone in different ways. And that's where intersectionality is a great lens to look at them. But then sometimes it might just overwhelm the message.
Yeah, I think I'm always of the view that if we want to be talking about issues in a holistic way, then we have to talk about the whole. And often for me or in my work, that does mean if we're talking about the whole, then we need to work from the from the outside inwards, like work from the margins inwards. And so, for example, if we're looking at pollution levels, if we don't talk about how pollution disproportionately impacts communities that are living in like low income areas and neighborhoods, and we're only talking about pollution in, places like Clifton, if anyone knows of Bristol, or just higher economic neighborhoods. If we're only talking about that, then we're not really tackling the problem. We're just shifting it somewhere else. So it's interesting. My way of approaching it is that if we want to look at these issues holistically, then we do have to look at the margins and work inwards, and that's really the only way.
I really like that. Yeah, because I think we get stuck in the big picture or in the details, and kind of working our way inward is quite a helpful approach. Is that something you've picked up from your years in this space, or is it just how you've approached things in the past?
Yeah, I would say it's an approach that's built up, and I think it's I suppose a way of reconceptualizing it that feels quite important, especially when we're thinking about justice and when we're thinking about frontline communities. It feels like it becomes a kind of necessary way of reframing it, I suppose.
And what are the ways it affects, like, if you say pollution, a marginalized, a more low income community, right? I'd imagine health has an aspect of it, right? It disproportionately affects their health compared to other types of communities. But what other effects does it, like pollution specifically, right? Let's just go with that. What effects does it have on communities? What effect does it have on vulnerable communities?
Yeah, so this is quite an interesting example, actually. So, for example, if we take pollution, then some of the approaches and solutions that have been used so far to try and kind of solve this issue is, say, having low emission zones, and having, say, in a city centre, can't drive certain cars through. But then there's a question of, okay, so where are these cars redirected? And there's a lot of kind of urban planning decisions that go into this. And often you'll see that these cars are then redirected into, again, low economic neighborhoods, right? And so pollution levels are just displaced to somewhere else. And that's something that has been planned. It's an urban planning decision. So firstly, there's that. And then also there's the issue of kind of community consultation. So, for example, again, in Bristol, we have a neighbourhood called Barton Hill. And they've had various kind of experiments in Barton Hill since the 50s, and one of the latest has been around a pedestrian zone. And there's been very little kind of consultation with them. And often these kinds of issues will crop up with communities that are low income, just like Barton Hill is, and also quite diverse, where there's little consultation. And these types of approaches are kind of experimented, see what will happen here, and maybe we can roll it out wider. So that can then have knock-on effects. So if communities aren't consulted on the solutions for these issues, then things crop up such as disabled communities now aren't able to say a car can't pull up to the social centre that they often go to because it can't go through the pedestrian zone, and they can't attend their meetings and social events, things like this, that if they've been consulted, it could have been understood. So,
right.
Yeah, there's kind of a mixture of ways that it can impact, but often the issue is it's redirecting one problem from one place, but to another, and to another community.
Right. Okay. Would you say this is like one of those symptoms of like institutions being so eager, like, yes, let's face the problem, and then they don't take people into consideration at all, right? Like they don't take like the actual people at the bottom, like classic, something so classic, especially like I feel in the UK, they have this because they local authorities are pretty powerful and they're very eager to solve things, and they'll just do it, and they have no idea how the effects are going to roll out, basically.
Yeah, and it's a very decolonial approach as well, because you're taking the time to move away from the top down thing and actually start from the bottom. So we have this idea, bring it over, or tell us what the issue is, and then we'll take that into the planning. And is that sort of how you approach climate justice in general with this decolonial approach?
Yeah, so it can exactly be that. Sometimes it's about organizations or institutions wanting to do good work and feeling this sense of urgency that's often talked about when we're looking at climate crisis. And so just wanting to roll it out as soon as possible. There is a big element of that. But I suppose that's exactly where this idea of trying to bring in intersectional and decolonial approaches to climate action planning comes in. So how can we help climate action planning teams to be able to have community-led approaches and to be able to have a broader understanding of which communities are on the front lines and most affected and which regions, and incorporate that in their planning? So that is quite a key element. And you are exactly right that can happen, especially in this sector. I think people do want to do good work, but can sometimes rush into it because of this messaging of the urgency.
Yeah, the crisis.
Well, people often forget that just having the intersectional approach, it just means remember the people involved, right? Remember who are the ones that are being affected by whatever is happening, right? In a broad sense.
And it goes back to what you're saying of not working in silos or individuals, but the whole community and taking everyone on board in that sense. And with all this community engagement, have you noticed any like specific challenges that marginalized communities face when they try to engage in climate movement? Is there a pattern or something that we can start tackling maybe?
Yeah, so I suppose something I've heard quite a lot from people of colour in the climate space, and especially young people of colour, is this sense of alienation and this sense of there being a right way of being a climate activist. And often I heard someone phrased it at an event recently that climate activists are always either hippie or punk.
Yep. It's the aesthetics.
Yeah. But it's interesting how in some ways that very funny way of kind of summarizing it trickles in from the grassroots, but also actually to when we're looking at like a sector level. It's interesting, some of the spaces, even in a kind of consultancy space, seeing the different approaches that come in. And there can be, for example, that typical like hippie approach to like nature connection or climate activism, which might appropriate certain cultural ways of connecting to the natural world and advocating for the natural world without giving them the ownership, and bringing that into like consultancy or facilitation spaces, and not necessarily kind of giving the credits. So it's interesting that something that kind of cultural pattern crops up in a lot of quite different spaces that fall under the climate movement. But I'd say that's one of the biggest elements I've had, that people have cited, is that feeling of alienation, that they're not being a climate activist in the right way.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And I definitely 100% feel that specifically, right? Because I it's just like, why would I want to fight for the environment? I want to fight for the justice. Why do I have to align with like a certain aesthetic or a certain like a historical thing? And it sometimes can be very frustrating.
Yeah, and there's a profile to stick to sometimes, and you've worked with a lot of organizations and a lot of groups, and this is something I've noticed particularly, where there's a vibe if you're part of a certain group, if you know what I mean. So an XR protester is very obviously an XR protester, and Just Up Oil is very obviously Just Up Oil, and it's part of the branding. We need to do marketing. But do you think that also alienates people from wanting to engage because they probably don't fit the aesthetic, in quotations?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I think in some ways, probably when these movements first started attaching themselves to a certain kind of lifestyle and an aesthetic, in some ways, part of that was probably quite helpful in bringing more people in, because there's a sign, you can tell that someone's an XR activist, as you mentioned, and it makes people curious. But I think now really we are getting to a stage where it is really alienating, and it doesn't necessarily kind of mobilize and bring communities together, but it gives a bit of a checklist of what potentially makes an activist and what doesn't. And that can put off a lot of people, especially young people, who are grappling with different ideas of identity and how to feel a part of the collective.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Especially if what we want is collective action, kind of finding that community is key in such formative years as well, right? It's what we normally do at this point.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. I like that. And I wanted to circle back a bit on the decolonial side, because I read a bit about your work where you highlight anti-racism in the climate space and in the climate justice space. Can you kind of walk us through what that is, what that looks like?
Yeah, so I do some work around environmental anti-racism, and I suppose there's a few different components to that. The most commonly known understanding of what that means is around inclusion, which is looking at the environmental sector as the second least diverse in the UK, with the number one being farming, and actually trying to...
That's pretty bad.
Yeah, trying to set that record straight. And yeah, organizations like the Race Report are doing work around that. And then there's another side of environmental anti-racism, which is looking at the kind of trickle-down effects of climate crisis and how it disproportionately impacts certain communities. So my work with Union of Justice mainly focuses on this in the pan-European context.
Yeah, okay. So kind of what you were saying earlier about we want to decongest the city center, but then the rerouting is through communities that are now going to get extra polluted. Fair. And how do you see race, class, maybe geography intersecting in Europe's climate policy? Is it something that's quite prevalent, or is it kind of like a footnote?
I think this type of work is actually still quite new in a lot of European, Western European countries. And it's also something that is under attack at the moment. If we're looking at the far right kind of swing across Europe, the idea of EDI is really under attack. And then also that kind of messaging helps to cloud out the work that's really trying to fix, the root causes, which is what I touched on before, where there's those disproportionate impacts on, say, communities of colour, but also disabled communities, LGBT communities. So to an extent, it's still quite new work. And for example, within Union of Justice, we're often working with quite grassroots groups who are working on this intersection. And there aren't loads of organizations who, have built up the infrastructure to do so. Yeah.
What do you think is the biggest barrier that organizations have when they're scaling to get to what you're saying, being, having a bit more influence, I guess, going more mainstream when they're working in such a new space?
I think one of the biggest ones, honestly, is around capacity and funding. I think in order to build the infrastructure, to have the time to build partnerships, outreach to, local councils, and then building up to kind of national policy, in order to have that time and capacity, then it needs to be funding. And I work obviously I work with nonprofits, but I also work with funding organizations. So I know from both sides of the coin how tricky and difficult that space is at the moment to be able to access funding. I think if we can find ways of ensuring that funding is more kind of flexible, there's something ridiculous, like what's the percentage? Something like 80% of London grants are only 1 year. And so, yeah. And so what does this mean? This means that projects try and build up infrastructure, and then they have to dismantle it after such short terms. And so that really cuts off groups and organizations from being able to scale enough to have like long-lasting relationships with other organizations and councils. It's a really tricky space at the moment.
That is a wild statistic. I never heard that it was just 1 year. Like, is it? Do you think it's because they just want to support as many things as possible and they just can't? They don't want to commit for multiple years for certain projects?
It's kind of true. Yeah. So a lot of funders are actually intermediary, right? So they're also fundraising to get the funds that they're then putting out in funding calls. So they then have to report their impact. So how do they maximize impact? Well, if they can maximize the number of organizations that they're funding, if they can maximize how many projects have come out of it, that's how it often leads to these very short terms and, you know, huge amounts of output.
Gotcha. So they basically say, this is your stuff to get started. Go ahead. face the world.
It feels a bit like a cycle as well, because if they have to do the thing so they can keep doing the other thing. And it's true, if you can't sustain a project for long term, you can't really scale it up, right? It takes at least 6 months to make sure the project even works.
Yeah.
That's
optimistic, I would feel, right? 6 months.
You're rubbing off on me. I'm getting optimistic. And I was reading as well that you describe yourself as a youth learning designer for social change. What is that? I really like it. But like, what does that involve? How can like learning design drive deeper climate action?
So learning design can range from an application to a lot of different types of spaces. So, for example, I used to work with Cornelio on a project for the Greater London Authority, and when constructing kind of fellowship programs for those working in civil society, then we kind of use learning design to think about, okay, how can they share knowledge with each other? What kind of knowledge do they need from us to be able to design more kind of community-focused programs and things like this? But when thinking about youth learning design and I suppose using some of those techniques and approaching it to the youth space and thinking about how can, what do young people need to know in order to be able to take action and to feel confident in doing so, to overcome that kind of imposter syndrome. And also how can they share knowledge with each other and how can that peer learning actually be quite an empowering kind of process for them and experience for them. Learning that.
I really like it. It's a great tagline. And I can imagine you face this both in the more campaigning aspects and advocacy of your work, but also in education, kind of balancing how much science and data you're using, but also bringing in lived experiences to center justice. Have you found that balance?
Yeah, I think they go hand in hand. So, for example, our latest research report with Union of Justice, it's called What's Race Got to Do with It? Climate Injustice in Europe Uncovered, for anyone listening that's interested.
I like it. Yeah, we're going to put it on the blog, guys.
Yep.
Oh, brilliant. And for example, when doing this research report, we didn't only want to find kind of quantitative data around experiences of environmental injustice. We also wanted to uplift community voice. And so it feels really key to have that mix of data, numerical data, that kind of making the case, factual information, but also uplifting stories from communities around what have been their personal journeys with these issues. What are they noticing communities are asking for and struggling with, and also what kind of gold have they struck in encountering these issues and working through them. I think it's amazing to hear some of the wisdom that comes from grassroots organising and what you can make from so little. So that really is something that I think researchers need to learn from as well, is kind of scaling up some of those solutions, community-led solutions.
I really like that. Well, we're going to get deeper into that, and you can check it out at the blog at tangeliclife.org. Thank you so much, Amber, for being here. You're not leaving yet. We're going to talk a bit more about movement building and solidarity, tying it back to the work that you do and just helping us understand a little bit more how we bring in intersectionality in a more natural way, I guess, right? Just like we want to live sustainably, let's keep it in mind. So thank you guys for tuning in, and we'll catch you on the next one. Bye.
Let's talk power, let's talk change. From rural lights to brighter days. Equity rising, voices strong. We're building tomorrow where we all belong. Tangelic Talks, energy, equity, pride. Empowering the world, side by side. A spark becomes a fire, a vision that's true. Together we rise, it starts with you.